Archer, Judge Stumbo, Congressman Perkins, distinguished members of the judiciary, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be here in Prestonsburg. We were talking in the car coming up here, and we were talking about the fact I've been in Athens and Rome and Rio de Janeiro and Singapore. Carl Perkins said, "You haven't lived. You haven't been any place unless you've been to Prestonsburg."
Mr. Kennedy, this was the last leg of his journey, and we found out from somebody that this was going to be his final destination here at the courthouse. So rather than be outside with the other 500 people who'd shown up, waiting in anticipation and cheering and everything, we came up here, and there was a podium at that time, back just a little bit beyond where this desk is, and I found out he'd be speaking there, so I set up a little cassette tape player. Now, I didn't know I was recording history. I grabbed a cassette that had some bluegrass on it. It was a used cassette, and brought it up here, along with a Polaroid camera that I used to take pictures for the paper. I set up my little cassette player, and within, it was a very short time. Now, here's a funny little story. They were afraid that there wouldn't be a good crowd in here. I don't know why they were afraid of that. Robert Kennedy was coming to Prestonsburg. But they were afraid there wouldn't be a big crowd in here, so they went up here to the jail and turned out all the inmates and brought them down here to pack the house. So Mr. Kennedy, he probably looked towards the back of the room and thought, well, that bunch towards the back's looking a little rough. Anyway, we came in here, and when everybody filed into the room, I mean, I was pressed right up against pretty much the podium, and he was maybe a foot higher or something than me. In those days when I took pictures, I had this Polaroid camera I was telling you about. If you remember those old Polaroid cameras, you took the picture, you pulled the picture out, and there was a little tube of stickum or gunkum that I don't know what to call it, but you spread that over the picture. If you didn't, it would the light would deteriorate the picture within a short time. So you had to prepare it. What I was doing was, while Mr. Kennedy was speaking and all these people were behind me, I would snap a picture, and then I would go down like this and out of sight of everybody, because I was going to have to pull that little picture out, and Eileen Bittman was on the other side of a table here underneath it. I would pass her the picture, and then I would stand back up and get ready for the next picture. I did this maybe 3 or 4 times. And I didn't want to, make a big noise or a scene or anything. I didn't want to interrupt his speech. The camera had a lens on it that was a close-up lens that was spring-loaded. And it was a tricky little camera, and I'd had problems with it before. Sometimes right while I was taking a picture, it would just pop off, and when it did, it would shoot like 6 or 7 feet. I took a picture of Mr. Kennedy, and you're going to see it here in a few minutes. And he was gesticulating. It was in the most important part of his speech, as he had his hand up and doing this. And when I took the picture, I squatted back down, and I barely brushed the edge of the podium. And right in the middle of his speech, that lens popped off, hit him in the chest. He jumped back. It hit the top of the podium, made a huge sound. The entire room went, "Whoa." And the Secret Service men went, "Whoa." And I'm standing there going, "Excuse me." And he says, "Hey, that's quite all right. You didn't interrupt us at all." That quick. And then he went on to speak, and then he said, "You come up here again, and I'll..." As it turned out, that little cassette tape recording is the only surviving recording of that speech. Later that day, I was able to get his autograph. We followed him down to the airport down here, the little airport on Old 23. And I found out he was going to wind up there and fly out from there. And he was such a person. He was down there on the tarmac, and there must have been another 150, 200 people down there with him. He's getting ready to leave. The little twin-engine plane he's getting ready to get on it. And a lot of people from Johnson County had pulled up on the road. Now, if you know where that little airport is, there's a slope. It sits down at the bottom, called Blockhouse Bottom or Harmon Station. And there's a slope of about 30 or 40 feet that goes up to the highway. And people were up there waving at him. And all of a sudden he broke away from the crowd and the Secret Service men, and he ran all the way up that slope by himself. Well, almost by himself. There was one person with him, me. And I was snapping pictures as I ran along beside of him. Somebody stole those pictures, by the way. And he shook hands with everybody, and then he came back down, and I circled around behind the plane. And the Secret Service people were keeping everybody at bay, and he waved goodbye. And I come around, and I'm between the plane's wing. The wing is going out this way, and the fuselage is here, and the door is here, and he's getting ready to step on it. He's standing here waving to everybody, and when he turns around to get on the plane, he looks right at me, and I snapped his picture. And that's when he dropped his campaign face. He didn't know anybody was there, and it was such a bone-weary look. I don't think there's ever been a picture taken of Mr. Kennedy that looked like that. He was tired after 2 days. He had a slight case of strabismus. You know, that's called a lazy eye. And nobody hardly ever noticed that, but in this picture you can see it. His eye is drifting. He was really tired. That picture exists somewhere, and I literally tore my house apart to find it. I saw it about 7 months ago, and if this video, if they do something with it, I promise you I'll find that picture and put it on there. We couldn't have it today.
A lot of Appalachian poverty is rooted, the explanation for it is rooted in culture, a culture of poverty. You've heard this before, right? Well, it's a rural area, it's different than urban area. There's urban eyes that people are looking at this region with, and they're seeing something different. So they see this culture of poverty, which means it's the way they live, the way they organize their lives. This is what causes poverty. There's another way of looking at that, which I think the 80s will embrace in a few years, and that's colonial model, which says that Appalachia is a colony of outside interest groups and are exploiting and extracting the wealth for their own gain. But because of that notion of urban, I think, and how we perceive our society as being urban, and post-1920, the census of 1920 classifies most Americans as urban. So we're kind of ending our second generation, our first generation, starting our second generation of urban America by the mid-60s. So we're coming at this from a different perspective. If you look at the country life movement in 1912, it's the opposite. Most people were still farmers then, and they looked at the rural as being the positive, as opposed to now in the 1960s, it's urban that's the positive. So because of this urban perspective, I think they see rural as being sort of odd and strange, and that's what we got to find. That's why you hear so much talk about, at least in the 60s, I think early on, you hear a bunch of talk about development. You know, as I was looking at all this, you hear stuff about development. Period. Development. Okay. What does that mean? Again. And I found out that, you know, when miners in the 30s who were trying to unionize were called communists. Oh, that sounds very familiar to me. And I read through what Kiffmeyer mentioned about how we label people communists. And they hate God, and they distribute propaganda. The Communist Librarian of the World, there you go. As I read through the hearing transcripts of the Kentucky American Activities Committee, it struck me that here it is again. You know, 30 years later, roughly, from the 30s to the 60s, the same way that we labeled union organizers communists in the 30s was the same way we labeled anti-poverty workers communists in the 60s. So the problem with it is because those forces were able to turn the wheels of the state and had access to the courts, and they essentially, I think they monopolized not just wealth and economic power, but political power and social power. You know, they had access. They knew how to operate the courts. They knew how to tap into those kind of reserves.
I want to finish up by speculating about what Robert Kennedy would have to say and what he would be doing about the problems of today if he were here. This is speculation. Kennedy would be working, I think, to raise people out of poverty. He would also be trying to find out what happened to all those people with dependent children who were dropped from the welfare rolls into a stagnant job market without adequate supportive service. He would also call attention to the transfer of massive amounts of money from the federal treasury to corporations in the name of free private enterprise. Robert Kennedy would be appalled at the rollback of regulations designed to ensure worker health and safety and to protect the environment. He would be outraged that corporate executives and lobbyists are writing legislation that is supposed to regulate their operations. He would be dismayed that corporate money now determines just what legislation will or will not be passed, no matter which party is in power. I think the United States is in grave trouble, and not just from the terrorists. We citizens have lost control of our government to vested interests, whose interests are not always our interests. Our workers and our environment are being used up without adequate recompense or respect or rehabilitative care. If not the current contenders for the presidency, then who will rise in our time to begin to fix these problems? And how do we make sure that most of us would support such a leader? Thank you all.